So let's talk a little bit about the readings for this week. So last week you read the first 2 chapters of Bala's book, where he just kind of set up his basic thesis. In these chapters, he hasn't really gotten around to defending his thesis yet. So, I mean, he's told us what he thinks. He thinks that we should have a dialogical picture of the history of science. That is, we should tell the story of the history of science in terms of a really long and complex conversations between different civilizations. He's going to come around to telling us why we should believe that too. That is, he's going to give us the evidence that's supposed to establish that claim. But he hasn't gotten there yet. He's got another step that he needs to get through. And it's one that I want to really give you a heads up about. Because if you're reading these chapters and you're reading them in the way that you would normally read, say, an introductory textbook, you're going to get really frustrated. So if you read this as though it's intro material, you're going to be very annoyed with it. But that's what I want to tell you about is what he's actually trying to do here. And if you know what he's trying to do, I think it'll be much less frustrating to read. So what he's doing is what's called a literature review. So a literature review is a very common thing for academics to do. And the idea is to go through the most important people who have talked about the same thing that you're going to talk about and sort of just review what they said about it. So you're trying to give a kind of highlights reel of other people who've weighed in on the subject that you're going to weigh in on. So chapter 3 is about people who have done histories of science that Bala thinks are Eurocentric. That is, that they've treated Europe as the sort of center and source of modern science. And in chapter 4, he talks about people who have done a more global picture of science. So people who are more on his way of telling the history of science. Now, if you're reading a literature review and you're new to the subject, as you almost certainly are in an introductory course like this one, you're going to see a whole bunch of names that you don't recognize. There's going to be a bunch of ideas that you're not familiar with, and they're not going to be explained in the way that you probably want them to be. Ideally, you might want each name to be sort of like explained, each idea to be laid out a bit, and Bala's really not doing that in these chapters. So partly a literature review is for other academics, to sort of show other academics that, yes, in fact, you have done the readings, you do know what you're talking about, you're not just sort of pulling this out of thin air. But there's another important function of a literature review that's potentially helpful to you who is new to this stuff. So if you're used to introductory textbooks or like lectures like this one, so what I'm trying to do is not throw ideas at you that I haven't explained. So if I think something is going to be new to you, I do my best to sort of lay it out in a way that you doesn't assume prior knowledge. So if you're used to the, let's call it the content delivery mode of things that you see in intro textbooks or hopefully your lectures, going through a literature review is going to be a dizzying experience and you're going to feel super frustrated. But if you think of it in terms of entry points for further research, then you'll hopefully feel a bit better about this. So the job that Bala is trying to do in these chapters is not so much introduce you to all this stuff as to lay out a bunch of places where you could start doing further research. You could start doing further research, one, because you think he's wrong about some of this stuff. So if you want to check his sources and say, oh, actually, this guy wasn't so Eurocentric as you thought he was, or, oh, this person was less dialogical than you said they were. So you can use a literature review to check where they're drawing their information from. And you can also use it to sort of further the research. So if you want to know where he's starting from, a literature review lets you sort of begin the same journey that he took. So I'd like to alert you to a psychological phenomena that is undoubtedly happened to you. It happens to me all the time. It's getting derailed while you're reading. So while you're reading, if you hit something that you are unfamiliar with or don't understand, or like a word that you don't know or a name that you're unfamiliar with, it's very, very common for you to get derailed. And by that, I mean something like you just put the book down and walk away, or what often happens to me is my eyes keep going over the words, but I'm not reading anymore. Like the words aren't sort of sinking in, but my eyes are still moving. And I don't notice for like half a page sometimes that my eyes are just moving over words and the real reading isn't happening anymore. Very often I can go back and find the point at which I got derailed. And it's something that I didn't understand, but didn't kind of catch that I didn't understand. So if you're going to read these chapters, I hope you're going to read these chapters, or if you're reading whatever, be alert for this. Be alert for those moments when you get derailed. And you can fight this by simply consciously noting, oh, I've never heard of that. Right? So if you just sort of consciously identify to yourself, there's a name I've never heard before. Oh, or hey, that's an idea that nobody's ever explained to me. So if you do that, you can sort of put a label on the stuff that you don't know. You might want to Google it. If it seems important to something that you're researching, you might not quickly Google who that was and when they're alive and what they did. Or you can just, if it doesn't look super important for your current purposes, you can just keep going, but with the conscious now identification of this is a gap in my knowledge. So that can help you from getting derailed. It can help you from getting too discouraged. And the fact is that nobody who's read a lot understood everything that they were reading. It's simply not the way it works. There's just too much to know. So learning to get good at moving through material where you're not familiar with all of the parts of the material is a really important skill as you move beyond simple introductory content delivery style stuff and into expanding your knowledge, dealing with new research, and that kind of thing. So that's one of the reasons why I asked you to read these chapters, is to practice these skills of not getting derailed when you encounter something that you're not familiar with. You haven't got time to look up everything in there. So, I mean, if you're sort of obsessively unable to move on until you've researched every single term, you're going to get bogged down. So learning the skill of moving on, assessing when it's important for you to look something up and when it's okay for you to keep going, but nonetheless marking something as I don't know about that is an important skill if you're going to continue doing research at a university level. Okay. So I think of a lit review as a kind of map. So here's a map of Berlin, to take a city at random. When I look at this map, I don't panic because I don't know all of the places or the roads or like what's there. So if I look at a specific point on a map of some unfamiliar territory, I don't go, oh no, I don't know any of these places, because that's not what I'm using a map for. I don't expect myself to already know all the contents of the map. I suggest that you think of a literature review like chapters 3 and 4 a little like that. So when you're using a map, what you do is pick out one location at a time as they become relevant to you. So if I'm trying to get around Berlin, I'd say, okay, I can see that the 96A connects to the 2, and that's important for me right now. So you can deal with a map bit by bit as the bits become important to you, and without expecting yourself to already know all about it. Similarly, with the lit review, it's a map of a territory. So he's laying out a bunch of places and points in the discussion that's happened over hundreds of years at sometimes. And the point is not to already know about every point in the literature. The point is to have a kind of map of it, so that if you've got some specific purpose, you want to research something in that literature, you can go to your map and find a place to get started. So I find it much less intimidating to think of these lit reviews as a map rather than as something that I'm supposed to understand top to bottom. Okay, so enough warnings. Let's talk very, very briefly about the content of these chapters. And again, I'm not going to expect you to know a heck of a lot of the details in here. We're actually going to come back to quite a bit of it as we discuss his argument overall and get further into the course. So a lot of the details that you're maybe skimming over at this point we'll come back to. So in chapter 3, as I said, he goes over a bunch of different histories of science, different ways of telling the history of science, all of which he thinks are overly focused on Europe as the main character in this story. So do pay attention, I would suggest, to one of the versions. The most developed sort of person in this story is Cohen. So do pay attention to his recounting of Cohen. I might expect you to know about that. Okay. So but what I was hoping you get out of this is the varieties of ways of telling history. So one important distinction is between internalist and externalist histories of science. So an internalist history of science focuses on the ways in which ideas shape future ideas. So the philosophy, the theory, the scientific theories that they're working with. An internalist history follows the history of science by going, this idea led to this idea, led to this idea. And you can contrast that with an externalist history. An externalist history looks at the way things like the broader society or politics or sometimes geography, the kind of factors external to science influence the way science changes. So in this course, we're doing a bit of a mix, I think. We'll hopefully be following some of the internalist trends, the way ideas shape other ideas. That's the sort of philosophy of science bit of this, but also the way that society and politics and religion and other sort of external factors help to shape science as well. So that's an interesting way of thinking about two different types of stories of history. Another one that he makes a distinction between is revolution and no revolution histories of science. So I've dropped the name the scientific revolution a few times, I think, in this course already. But there's actually a debate amongst historians of science, some of whom say in the, let's say, 1600s or so, there was a radical break in the way people did investigations of the natural world. We completely changed gears, and after that, science kind of takes off, right? Those are the scientific revolution people. There's another group of people who think that there wasn't such a dramatic break. So it's often understood, people often think that in the medieval European world, people were just illiterate and uninformed and everything was stagnant and bad. But a lot of it was actually going on intellectually in the medieval European world. So some people think that there's much more continuity in the development of ideas than is implied by the scientific revolution. We're actually going to read a little bit of this book by Stephen Shapin called The Scientific Revolution, which he starts with the following sentence. There was no such thing as the scientific revolution, and this is a book about it. So witty, right? Okay, so there's another sort of division between, internalist, externalist, revolution, no revolution histories of science. And of course, Ball is going to try to argue for another kind of distinction between Eurocentric and dialogical pictures of the history of science. So one reason why I wanted to read these chapters is to get a taste for what it's like to read a lit review, practice the skills for getting through one of these without getting too discouraged, but also to get a taste for how many different ways there are of telling the story of the history of science. There's a lot. These are the major distinctions, and there's a whole bunch of finer ones. And the debate continues and the discussion continues about how exactly the best way to tell this story is. Okay, and then in chapter 4, Balla just lays out some of the precursors for his own view. So people who are working in the same direction as him, maybe they don't have exactly the same way of putting it, but whose work he's drawing on to develop his own story. Nobody starts from scratch. One of the important reasons to do a literature review is to acknowledge that you're using other people's ideas. So in this chapter, that's partly what he's doing. Particularly notable is this collection of books up here called Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham. So this is published in the 1950s. It still stands as one of the sort of monumental moves in shifting people in the West's ideas of how other cultures practiced science. So Needham's books really introduced people to the fact that China had very advanced science and technology for most of the period in which we think of the development of science happening. So Needham wasn't exactly doing a dialogical history, but one of the things that you need in place to do dialogical history is an awareness of what the various cultures were doing. And prior to somebody like Needham coming along and bringing this stuff into English, I mean, it's well known in China that this stuff happened, but to bring it into the Western conversation, huge amount of translation work and sort of synthesis work is required. But before that, people were unaware, and they took their ignorance of, say, for example, Chinese science and technology as evidence of a lack of Chinese science and technology. So the building blocks for Allah's view are a long sort of, the last 75 years or so of scholarship trying to bring into the sort of Western canon knowledge about other cultures. Okay, so that's about all I think that you need to know from this stuff. I hope I've picked out the sort of highlights. And again, practice this skill of reading when you're in over your head, essentially. So treat this thing like a map, right? Treat it like you're not supposed to know all the points in it, but that once you have a goal in mind when you're going through the literature, you can use this as a way to be oriented in the larger literature.